Hello, everyone. It's great to be speaking with all of you today from Vancouver, Canada. I love the DevOps Enterprise Summit community and the London event because of how it's constantly advancing the state of the practice in DevOps, Agile, and in the end, how software is built. So instead of doing the typical project to product talk, today I'm going to tell you my last 12 months of lessons learned from collecting all of the different flow data that we've measured across many organizations' value streams. I've collected some of the most interesting stories. I'm going to tell you how they actually help highlight some of the 5 ideals that we've learned from the Unicorn project, and we'll show you some of these flow diagnostics. I've never seen data of this kind before, where it's live, real data from large organizations, not just open source projects, not just smaller product value streams, but true enterprise end-to-end data. So I really hope that this data set helps us all advance the state of the art on how software is built and how we can help our organizations transform and scale. Now, to really understand data and software at scale, we need to go to where the work is being done. In production, we go to the factory floor. So this is what's called Gamba, the actual place where work happens. This is something that Taichi Ono said it was key for executives to take a portion of each week to learn where production happens, how production happens, where waste could be found, and to really understand what's going on on the production line, to focus on learning. And it's really directed at executives. So the people who are making decisions about how productions happen, because of course the people on the floor itself, they tended to know what was wrong. They had things down the line, such as the andon cord. And it became a key part of lean management. So what I really want to understand is how going to Gemba actually manifests itself. I did that through a 2-day trip of going to Gemba at the BMW Leipzig plant. So this is me and my colleagues there, and Strata is one of the characters in the Project to Product book, and we had this 2-day, not just 45-minute, like Taichi Ono recommended, but this full 2-day Gamba Walk. And it was fascinating. I learned amazing things about production, around how you connect business to delivery through these amazing advanced production lines. But there's also something that struck me as very different. This is something that Don Reinerson's pointed out, and it's a problem of not being able to see and observe directly what happens in parts of production. Now, with cars, it's fairly straightforward. So to understand quality problems, we just need to look at the rework portion of the production line. To understand where bottlenecks are, we actually see where production slows down, or we have the largest error rates, things like high complexity of wiring harnesses. But the challenge is that once we're shift to intangibles, once we are no longer producing cars or physical objects, it gets much more difficult to see what production is like. And Gamba walks are all about seeing flow across value streams. So we no longer understand, unless we have a way of observing the production of intangibles, and software is not tangible. It's not something that we can touch. We're not understanding how that flow happens. The big challenge with that, of course, is, and this is something that Daniel Kahneman talked about in Thinking Fast and Slow, is that what you see is all there is a common fallacy that leaders have, that actually everybody has. So we assume that what we see is sufficient. And if we're only seeing things like org charts, if we're only seeing things like budgets and cost centers, then that's how we're making decisions on how software should be built. Now, this is very different to what technologists see when they're building software, because for technologists, those intangibles are very real. They're the code that we touch. They're the infrastructure that we're constantly managing and improving and debugging. So I noticed that there's this very large disconnect between what reality was, what executives saw on the software side, and what practitioners actually saw, and that we need to connect these two worlds. So the question really becomes is, how does Gamba work for intangibles, for building software, digital, and data assets in our organizations? Is it sufficient that we do management by walking around and executives have conversations with different staff who are working on different parts of the software portfolio? Are meetings sufficient where you actually do where you review the software that's being built? Is it sufficient to have a big room planning and all those kinds of ceremonies that we've put into Agile frameworks, and to effectively connect the way that we do planning and conversations around business strategy to the software that's being built? So personally, having experienced all those things, worked with countless organizations to see how they implemented them, how they did their things like big group planning or PI planning or implementing A4s to connect business to software, I realized that these things really weren't sufficient. That the further that you were from the code, the further that you were actually from the actual work. So the closer you got to the code, the better, meaning the closer that you understood the flows that were actually happening, the problems that were there, the distractions and the issues and the architectural issues that developers were constantly struggling with, or that others were constantly struggling with. So the question for me became, how can we actually get this information into the right state to understand and for people to see? How can we have the right kind of Gamba Walk, given that conversations simply aren't enough when you're talking about software at a very large scale? And really, for me, this journey produced the flow framework. The goal of the flow framework was to have a way of inspecting, and you see at the bottom layer of the flow framework there, inspecting the work that was actually happening, because this magical thing happens with software, which is that we use very advanced tools, and the work happening in the tools actually represents the work that's going on. So if we could somehow, at the right level, inspect those tools, then we could maybe get some kind of better view that would make sense both to the technology side and to executives. And a key part of my PhD thesis about understanding value streams and flow was actually to understand and to create these abstractions on what was flowing through those tools that represented our work as we work on defects and incidents and improving the software through features and architecture improvements and so on. So the question became, is how can we make this better model, this more abstract model of how we work? We know that we need to connect to where the work is happening. That is the whole point of the Gamba, to dig right into that, but that we need to show this at a more abstract level, because I've seen many executives do things like learning to code classes and such, and it's not quite enough to understand the code, because in the end, we need to see the way that code flows, the way that value flows.